Mad Monkton, Chapter 6. I returned at the top of my speed to the village where I had left the mules, had the animals saddled immediately, and succeeded in getting back to Fondi a little before sunset. While ascending the stairs of our hotel, I suffered under the most painful uncertainty as to how I should best communicate the news of my discovery to Alfred. If I could not succeed in preparing him properly for my tidings, the results, with such an organization as his, might be fatal. On opening the door of his room, I felt by no means sure of myself, and when I confronted him, his manner of receiving me took me so much by surprise that for a moment or two I lost my self-possession altogether. Every trace of the lethargy in which he was sunk when I had last seen him had disappeared. His eyes were bright, his cheeks deeply flushed, and as I entered he started up and refused my offered hand. "You have not treated me like a friend," he said passionately. "You had no right to continue the search unless I searched with you. You had no right to leave me here alone. I was wrong to trust you. You are no better than the rest of them." I had by this time recovered a little from my first astonishment, and was able to reply before he could say anything more. It was quite useless in his present state to reason with him or to defend myself. I determined then to risk everything and break my news to him at once. "You will treat me more justly, Monkton, when you know that I have been your good service during my absence," I said. "Unless I am greatly mistaken, the object to which I have left Naples may be near attainment by both of us, and—" The flush left his cheek almost in an instant. Some expression in my face, or some tone in my voice, of which I was not conscious, had revealed to his nervously quickened perception more than I intended that he should know at first. His eyes fixed themselves intently on mine. His hand grasped my arm, and he said to me in quite an eager whisper, "Tell me the truth at once. Have you found him?" I was too late to hesitate. I answered in the affirmative. "Buried or unburied?" His voice rose abruptly as he put the question, and his unoccupied hand fastened on my other arm. "Unburied." I had hardly uttered the word before the blood flew back into his cheeks, his eyes flashed again as they looked into mine, and he burst into a fit of quite triumphant laughter, which shocked and startled me quite inexplicably. "What did I tell you? What did you say to the old prophecy now?" he cried, dropping his hold on my arms and pacing back and forth in the room. "Own you are wrong. Own it, as all Naples shall own it, when once I got him safe in his coffin." His laughter grew more and more violent. I tried to quiet him in vain, and his servant and the landlord of the inn entered the room, but they only added fuel to the fire, and I made them go out again. As I shut the door on them, I observed lying on a table near at hand a packet of letters from Miss Amise, which my unhappy friend preserved with such quiet care, and read and reread with such unfailing devotion. Looking toward me just when I passed by the table, the letters caught his eye. The new hope for the future, in connection with this writer of them, which my news has already awakened in his heart, seemed to overwhelm in an instant at sight of the treasured memorials that reminded him of his betrothed wife. His laughter ceased. His face changed, and he ran to the table, caught the letters up in his hand, looked from them to me for one moment with an altered expression which went straight to my heart, then sank down on his knees at the table, laid his face on the letters, and burst into tears. I let his new emotion have its way, uninterruptedly, and quieted the room without saying a single word. When I returned after a lapse of some time, I found him sitting quietly in his chair, reading one of the letters from the packet which rested on his knee. His look was quite kindness itself, his gesture almost womanly in its gentleness as he rose to meet me, and he anxiously held out his hand. He was quite calm enough now to hear in detail all that I had to tell him. I suppressed nothing but the particulars of the state which I had found the corpse. I assumed no right of direction as to the share he was to take in our future proceedings, with the exception of insisting beforehand that we should leave the absolute superintendence of the removal of the body to me, and that he should be satisfied with a sight of M. Foyland's paper, after receiving my assurances that the remains placed in the coffin were really and truly the remains of which we had in search. "Your nerves are not as strong as mine," I said, by way of apology for my apparent direction, "and for that reason I must beg leave to assume the leadership in all that we have now to do. Until I see the leaden coffin soldered down and safe in your possession, after that I shall resign all my functions to you." "I want words to thank you for your kindness," he answered. "No brother could have borne with me more affectionately, or helped me more patiently than you." He stopped, and grew quite thoughtful, then occupied himself in tying up slowly and carefully the packet of Miss Emile's letters, and then looked suddenly toward the vacant wall behind me, with what strange expression, the meaning of which I knew so well. Since we had left Naples, I had purposely avoided exciting him by talking of the useless and shocking subject of the apparition by which he believed himself to be perpetually followed. Just now, however, he seemed so calm and quite collected, so little likely to be violently agitated by any allusion to the dangerous topic, that I ventured it out loud. "Does the phantom still appear to you," I asked, "as it appears in Naples?" He looked at me and smiled. "Did I not tell you that it followed me everywhere?" His eyes wandered back again to the vacant space, and he went on speaking in that direction as if he had been continuing the conversation with some third person in the room. "We shall part," he said slowly and softly, "when the empty place is filled in Wincot Vault. Then I shall stand with Ada before the altar in the Abbey chapel, and when my eyes meet hers, they will see the tortured face no more." Saying this, he leaned his head on his hand, sighed, and began repeating softly to himself the lines of those old prophecies. "When in Wincot Vault a place waits for ones of Monkton's race, when that one forlorn shall lie, graveless under open sky, beggared of 6 feet of earth, through lord of acres from his birth, that shall be a certain sign of the end of Monkton's line, dwindling ever faster, dwindling to the last left master, for mortal ken from light of day, Monkton's race shall pass away." Fancying that he pronounced the last lines slightly incoherently, I tried to make him change the subject. He took no notice of what I said and went on talking to himself. "Monkton's race shall pass away," he repeated, "but not with me. The fatality hangs over my head no longer. I shall bury the unburied dead. I shall fill the vacant place in Wincot Vault, and then, oh, new life, new blessed life with Ada." The name seemed to recall him to himself. He drew his traveling desk toward him, placed the packet of letters in it, and then took out a sheet of paper. "I am going to write to Ada," he said, turning to me, "and tell her the good news. Her happiness, when she knows it, will be even greater than mine." Worn out by the events of the day, I left him writing and went to bed. I was, however, either too anxious or too tired to sleep. In his waking condition, my mind naturally occupied itself with the discovery at the convent, and with the events to which that discovery would in all perpetually lead. As though on the future, a depression for which I could not account weighed on my spirits. There was not the slightest reason for the vague melancholy foreboding what pressed me. The remains, to the findings of which my unhappy friend attached so much importance, had been traced. They would certainly be placed at his disposal in a few days, and he might take them to England by the first merchant vessel that sailed from Naples, and the gratification of his strange carapace thus accomplished, there was at least some reason to hope that his mind might recover to its old tone, and that a new life would lead at Wincot might result in making him a happy man. Such considerations as these were, in themselves, certainly not calculated to exert my melancholy influence over me, and yet all through the night the same inconceivable, unaccountable depression weighed so heavily on my spirits. Heavily through the hours of the darkness, heavily even when I walked out to breathe the first freshness of the early morning air. With the day came the old engrossing business of opening negotiations with authorities. Only those who have had to deal with the Italian officials can imagine how our patient was tried by every single one of them that we were in contact with. We were bandied about from one authority to the other, stared at, cross-questioned, mystified. Not in the least case the case presented any specific difficulties or any sort of intricacies, but because it was absolutely necessary that every civil dignitary to whom we applied should assert his own importance by leading us to our object in the most roundabout manner possible. After our first day's experience for official life in Italy, I left the absurd formalities, which we had no choice but to perform, to be accomplished by Alfred alone, and applied myself to the really serious question of how the remains of the convent outhouse were to be safely removed. The best plan that suggested itself to me was to write to a friend in Rome, where I knew it was accustomed to embalm the bodies of high dignitaries of the church, and there, I consequently inferred, such chemical assistance as was needed in our emergency might be obtained. I simply stated in my letter that the removal of the body was imperative, then described the condition in which I had found it, and engaged that no expense on our part should be spared if the right person or persons could be found to help us. Here again, more difficulties interposed themselves, and more useless formalities were to be gone through. But in the end, patience, perseverance, and money triumphed, especially money. And 2 men came expressly from Rome to undertake the duties that we required of them. It is unnecessary that I should shock the reader by entering into any detail in this part of my narrative, when I have said that the progress of the decay was so far suspended by chemical means as to allow the remains being placed in a coffin, and to ensure their being transported to England with perfect safety and quite convenience. I have said enough. After 10 days had been wasted in useless delays and difficulties, I had the satisfaction of seeing the convent outhouse empty at last, passed through a final ceremony of snuff-taking, or rather snuff-giving, with the old capuchin, and ordered the travelling carriages to be ready at the inn door. Hardly a month had elapsed since our departure as we entered Naples, successful in the achievement of design which had been ridiculed as wildly impractical by every friend of ours who had ever heard of it. The first object to be accomplished on our return was to obtain the means of carrying the coffin to England, by sea as a matter of course. All inquiries after a merchant vessel on the point of sailing for any British port led to the most unsatisfactory results. There was only one way of ensuring the immediate transportation of the remains to England, and that was to simply hire a vessel. Impatient to return, and resolved not to lose sight of the coffin till he had seen it placed in Wincot Vault, Monkton decided immediately on hiring the first ship that could ever be obtained. The vessel in port, which we were informed would soon as get ready for sea, was a Sicilian brig, and this vessel my friend accordingly engaged. The best dockyard artisans that could be got were to set to work, and the smartest captain and crew to be picked up on an emergency in Naples were chosen to navigate this brig. Monkton, after again expressing in the warmest terms his gratitude for all the services I had rendered him, disclaimed any intention of asking me to accompany him on his voyage to England. Greatly to his surprise and delight, however, I offered, of my own accord, to take this passage with him. The strange coincidence was I had witnessed, the extraordinary discovery I had hit on since our first ever meetings at Naples, had made his one great time interest in life, my one great interest for the time being as well. I shared none of his delusions, the poor fellow, but it is hardly an exaggeration to say that my eagerness to follow our remarkable adventure to its end was as great as his anxiety to see the coffin laid in Wincot Vault. Curiosity influenced me, I'm afraid, almost as strongly as the friendship we had bonded, when I offered myself as the companion for his voyage home. We set sail for England on a calm and quite lovely afternoon. For the first time since I had known him, Monkton seemed to be in quite high spirits. He talked and jested on all sorts of subjects, and laughed at me for allowing my cheerfulness to be affected by dread of seasickness. I had readily no such fear. It was my excuse to my friend for a return of that unaccountable depression under which I had suffered at Fondi. Everything was in our favour. Everybody on board the brig was in good spirits. The captain was delighted with the vessel. The crew, Italians and Maltese, were in high glee at the prospect of making a short voyage on such high wages in a well-provisioned ship. I alone felt heavy at heart, and there was no valid reason I could assign to myself for the melancholy that oppressed me, and yet struggled against it in vain I did. Late on our first night at sea, I made a discovery which was by no means calculated to restore my spirits to their usual equilibrium. Monkton was in his cabin, on the floor of which I had been placed the packing case containing the coffin, and I was on deck. The wind had fallen almost to a calm, and I was lazily watching the sails of the brig as they flapped from time to time against the masts, when the captain approached, and drawing me out of hearing, whispered in my ear, "There's something wrong among the men forward. Do you observe how suddenly they all became silent just before sunset?" I had observed it, and I told them so. "There's a Maltese boy on board," pursued the captain, "who is a smart enough lad, but a bad one to deal with. I found out that he's been telling the men there's a dead body inside that packing case of your friends in the cabin." My heart sank as he spoke. Knowing the superstitious rationality of sailors, and foreign sailors especially, I had taken care to spread a report on board the brig, before the coffin was shipped, that the packing case contained a valuable marble statue, which Mr. Monkton prized quite highly, and was unwilling to trust of his own sight. How could this Maltese boy have discovered that the pretended statue was actually a human corpse? As I pondered over this question, my suspicions fixed themselves on Monkston's servant, who spoke Italian quite fluently, and whom I knew to be an incorrigible gossip. The man denied it when I charged him with betraying us, but I never believed his denial, still to this day. "The little imp won't say where he picked up this notion of his about the dead body," continued the captain. "It's not my place to pry into secrets, but I advise you to call the crew aft, and contradict the boy, whether he speaks the truth or not. The men are parcel fools who believe in ghosts and all the rest. Some of them say they would never have signed our articles if they knew they were going to sail with a dead man. Others only grumble. But I'm afraid we shall have some trouble with them all, in case of rough weather, unless the boy is contradicted by you or the other gentlemen. The men say that if either you or your friend tell them on your words of honour the Maltese is a liar, they'll hand him up by the rope's end accordingly, but that if you won't, they'll made up their minds to believe the boy." Here the captain paused and awaited my answer. I could give him none. I felt hopeless under our desperate emergency. To get the boy punished by giving my word of honour to support a direct falsehood was not to be thought of even for a moment. What other means of extrication for this miserable dilemma remained? None that I could think of. I thanked the captain for his attention of our interests, and told him I would take time to consider what course I should pursue, and begged that he should say nothing to my friend about this discovery he had made. He promised to be silent, quite sulkily, and then walked away from me. We had expected the breeze to spring up with the morning, but no breeze came. As it wore on toward noon, the atmosphere became insufferably sultry, and the sea looked still as smooth as glass. I saw the captain's eye turn often and anxiously windward. Far away in that direction, and alone in the blue heaven, I observed a small black cloud, and asked if it could bring us any wind. "More than we want," the captain replied shortly, and then, to my astonishment, ordered the crew aloft to take in sail. The execution of this maneuver showed but too plainly the temper of the men. They did their work quite sulkily and slowly, grumbling and murmuring among themselves. The captain's manner, as he urged them on with oaths and threats, convinced me we were in quite danger. I looked again to windward. The one little cloud had enlarged to a great bank of murky vapor, and the sea at the horizon had started to change in color. "The squall will be on us before we know where we are," said the captain. "Go below. You'll only be in the way here." I descended to the captain and prepared Monkton for what was coming. He was still questioning me about what I observed on deck when the storm burst on us. We felt the little brig strain for an instant, as if she would part in two. Then she seemed to be swinging around with us. Then to be quite still for a moment, trembling in every timber. Last came a shock which hurled us from our seats, a deafening crash, and a flood of water pouring into the cabin. We clambered half-drowned to the deck. The brig had, in the nautical phase, broached to, and she now lay on her beam ends. Before I could make out anything distinctly in that horrible confusion except the one tremendous certainty that we were entirely at the mercy of the sea, I heard a voice from the fore part of the ship which stilled the clamoring and shouting of the rest of the crew in an instant. These words were in Italian, but I understood their fatal meaning only too easily. We sprung a leak, and the sea was pouring into the ship's hold like the race of a mill-stream. The captain did not lose his presence of mind in this fresh emergency. He called for his axe to cut away the foremast, and ordering some of the crew to help him, directed the others to rig out the pumps. The words had hardly passed his lips before the men broke into open mutiny. With a savage look at me, the ringleader declared that the passengers might do as they pleased, but he and his messmates were determined to take the boat and leave the accursed ship, and the dead man in her, to go to the bottom together. As we spoke, there was a shout among the sailors, and I observed some of them pointing derisively behind me. Looking around, I saw Monkton, who had hitherto kept close to my side, making his way back to the cabin. I followed him directly, but the water and confusion on deck, and the impossibility from the position of the brig of moving the feet without the slow assistance of the hands, so impeded my progress that it was impossible for me to ever overtake him. When I got below, he was crouched upon the coffin, with the water on the cabin floor whirling and splashing about him as the ship heaved and plunged. I saw a warning brightness in his eyes, and a flushness in his cheeks, and I approached and said to him, "There is nothing left for it, Alfred, but to bow to our misfortune and do the best we can to save our lives." "Go, save yours," he cried, waving his hand for me, "for you have some future before you. Mine is gone when this coffin goes to the bottom. If the ship sinks, I shall know that the fatality is accomplished, and I shall sink with her." I saw that there was no stat to be reasoned with or persuaded, and raised myself again to the deck. The men were cutting away all obstacles so as to launch the longboat, placed amidships over the depressed bulwark of the brig as she lay on her side, and the captain, after having made a vast and last vain exertion to try and restore his authority, was looking at them in silence. The violence of the squall seemed ready to be spending in itself, and I asked whether there was really no chance for us if we had remained by the ship. The captain answered that there might have been the best chance if the men obeyed his orders, but now there was none. Knowing that I could have no place but dependence on the presence of the mind of Monkston's servant, I confided to the captain, in the fewest and plainest words, the condition of my unhappy friend, and asked if I might depend on his help. He nodded his head, and we descended together to the cabin. Even to this day, it cost me quite pain to write of the terrible necessity to which the strength and obstinacy of Monckton's delusion reduced us in the last resort. We were compelled to secure his hands, and drag him by main force to the desk. The men were on the point of launching the boat, and refused at first to receive us into it. "You cowards!" cried the captain. "Have we got the dead man with us this time? Isn't he going to the bottom along with the brig? Who are you afraid of when we get into the boat?" This sort of appeal produced the desired effect, and the men became ashamed of themselves, and retracted their refusal. Just as we pushed off from the sinking ship, Alfred made one more effort to break from me, but I held him firm. and he never repeated the attempt. He sat by me with drooping head, still and silent, while the sailors rowed away from the vessel. Still and silent when, with one accord, they paused at a little distance off, and we all waited and watched to see the brig sink, still and silent. Even when that sinking happened, when the laboring hull plunged slowly into the hull of the sea, it hesitated, as it seemed for one moment, rose a little again, and then sank to rise no more. She sank with her dead freight, sank and snatched forever from our power the corpse which we had discovered almost by pure miracle, those jealously preserved remains, on the safekeeping of which rested so strangely the hopes and the love destinies of two living beings. As the last signs of the ship in the depths of the water, I felt Monkton trembling all over as he sat close to my side, and I heard him repeating to himself over and over again the name of Ada. I tried to return his thoughts to another subject, but it was quite useless. He pointed to the sea where the brig had once been, and where nothing was left to look but the rolling waves. That empty place will now remain empty forever in Wincott Vault. As he said these words, he fixed his eyes for a moment sadly and earnestly on my own face, and then he looked away, leaned his cheek on his hand, and spoke no more. We were sighted long before nightfall by a trading vessel, and were taken on board. We landed at Cartagena in Spain. Alfred never held up his head, never once spoke to me of his own accord the whole time we were at sea in the merchantman. I observed, however, with alarm, that he talked often and incoherently to himself, constantly muttering the lines of the old prophecy, constantly referring to the fatal place that was empty in Wincott Vault, constantly repeating in broken accents, which it affected me inexplicably to hear, the name of the poor girl who was waiting his return to England. Nor were these the only causes for the apprehension that I now felt on his account. Toward the end of our voyage he began to suffer from alternations of fever fits and shivering, which I ignorantly imagined to be the attacks of ague. I was soon undeceived, and we had hardly been a day on shore before he became so much worse that I secured the best medical assistance Cartagena could afford. For a day or two the doctors differed, as usual, about the nature of his complaint, but ere long alarming symptoms displayed themselves. The medical men declared that his life was in danger, and told me his disease was brain fever. Shocked and grieved as I was, I hardly knew how to act at first under the fresh responsibilities now laid upon me. Ultimately, I decided on writing to the old priest who had been Alfred's tutor, and who, as I knew, still resided at Wincott Abbey. I told this gentleman all that had happened, begged him to break my melancholy news as gently as possible to Miss Emise, and assured him of my resolution to remain with Monkton to the very last. After I had dispatched my letter and had sent to Gibraltar to secure the best English medical advice that could be obtained, I felt that I had done all I could, and that nothing remained but to wait and hope. Many a sad and anxious hour did I pass by my poor friend's bedside. Many a time did I doubt whether I had done the right thing in giving any encouragement to his delusion. The reasons for doing so which had suggested themselves to me after my first interview with him seemed, however, on reflection, to be valid reasons still. The only way of hastening his return to England, and to Miss Emise, who was pining for that return, was the way in which I had taken. It was not my fault that a disaster which no man could foresee had overthrown all of his projects and all of mine. By now, the calamity had happened and was irretrievable. How, in the event of this physical recovery, was this moral malady to be combated? When I reflected on the hereditary taint in his mental organization, on that first childish fright of Stephen Monkton from which he had never recovered, on the previously secluded life which he had led at the Abbey, and on his firm persuasion of the reality of the apparition by which he believed himself to be constantly followed, I confessed, I despaired of shaking his superstitious faith in every word and line of the old family prophecy. If the series of striking coincidences which appeared to attest its truth had made a strong and lasting impression even on me, and this was assuredly the case, how could I wonder what they had produced the effect of absolute conviction on his own mind? Constituted as it was, if I argued with him, and he answered me, how could I rejoin? If he said, the prophecy points to the last of my family, I am the last of the family. The prophecy mentions an empty place in Wincott Vault. There is such an empty place. On the faith of the prophecy, I told you Stephen Monkton's body was unburied, and you found it unburied. If he said all of this, what was I to say? That this was only strange coincidence? The more I thought of the task that lay before me, if he recovered, the more I felt inclined to despond. The oftener the English physician who attended on him said to me, he may get better of the fever, but he has a fixed idea, which never leaves him night or day, which has ascertained unsettled his reason, and which will end in killing him, unless you or some of his friends can somehow remove it. The more often I heard this, the more acutely I felt my own powerlessness, the more I shrank from every idea that was connected with the hopeless future. I had only expected to receive my answer from Wincott in the shape of a letter. It was consequently a great surprise, as well as a great relief, to be informed one day that 2 gentlemen wished to speak to me, and find that of these 2 gentlemen, the first was the old priest, and the second a male relative of the Miss Amies. Just before their arrival, the fever symptoms had disappeared, and Alfred had pronounced out of danger. Both the priest and his companion were eager to know when the sufferer would be strong enough to travel. They had come to Cartagena expressly to take him home, and felt more hopeful than I did for the restorative effects of his native air. After all the questions connected with the first important point of the journey to England had been asked and answered, I ventured to make some inquiries after Miss Amies, and her relative informed me that she was suffering both in body and in mind from the excessive anxiety on Alfred. They had been obliged to deceive her as to the dangerous nature of his illness in order to deter her from accompanying the priest and her relation to the mission in Spain. Slowly and imperfectly, as the weeks wore on, Alfred regained something of his former physical strength, but no alteration appeared in the illness as it affected his mind. From the very first day of his advance toward recovery, it had been discovered that the brain fever had exercised the strangest influence over his faculties of memory. All recollection of recent events was gone from him. Everything connected with Naples, with me, with his journey, had dropped in some mysterious manner entirely of his remembrance. So completely had all late circumstances passed from his memory, that though he recognized the old priest and his old servant easily on the first days, he never recognized me, but regarded me with such wistful, doubting expression, and I felt inexpressibly pained when I approached his bedside. All his questions were about Miss Amies and Wincott Abbey, and all his talk referred to the period when his father was yet still alive. The doctors argued good rather than ill from his loss of memory of recent incidents, saying that it would turn out to be quite temporary, and that it answered the first great healing purpose of keeping his mind at ease. I tried to believe them, tried to feel as sanguine, and when the day came for his departure, the old friends felt who were taking him home, but the effort was too much for me. A foreboding that I should never see him again approached my heart, and the tears came into my eyes as I saw the worn figure of my poor friend, half helped, half lifted into the traveling carriage, and borne away gently on the road toward home. He never recognized me, and the doctors had begged that I would give him, for some time to come, as few opportunities possible of doing so, but for this request I should have accompanied him myself to England. As it was, nothing better remained for me to do than to change the scene, and recruit as I best could my energies of body and mind, depressed of late by much watching and anxiety. The famous cities of Spain were not new to me, but I visited them again, and revived old impressions of the Alhambra and Madrid. Once or twice I thought of making a pilgrimage to the east, but late events had sobered and altered me. That yearning, unsatisfied feeling which we call homesickness began to prey upon my heart, and I resolved to return to England. I went back by way of Paris, having settled with the priest that I should write to me at my banker there as soon as we could after Alfred had returned to Wincott. If I had gone to the east, the letter would have been forwarded to me. I wrote to prevent this, and on my arrival at Paris, stopped at the banker before I went to my hotel. The moment the letter was put in my hand, the black border on the envelope told me the worst. He was dead. There is but one consolation. He had died calmly, almost happily, without once referring to those fatal chances which had wrought the fulfillment of the ancient prophecy. My beloved pupil, the priest wrote, seemed to rally a little at the first few days after his return, but he gained no real strength, and soon suffered a slight relapse of fever. After this he sank gradually and gently day by day, and so departed from us on the last dreaded journey. Miss Amies, who knows I am writing this, desires me to express her deep and lasting gratitude for all of your kindness to Alfred. She told me when you brought him back that she had waited for him as his promised wife, and that she would nurse him now as a wife should. She never left him. His face was turned toward her, his hand was clasped in hers when he died. It will console you to know that he never mentioned his events in Naples, or the shipwreck that followed them, from the day of his return to the day of his death. 3 days after reading the letter, I was at Wincott and heard all the details of Alfred's last moment from the priest himself. I felt a shock which it would not be very easy for me to analyze or explain when I heard that he had been buried, at his own desire, in the fatal abbey vault. The priest took me down to see the place, a grim, cold, subterranean building, with a low roof, supported on heavy Saxon arches. Narrow niches and the ends only of coffins visible within them ran down each side of the vault. As I walked across the glass glade leading down the vault, I heard the rustle of a woman's dress behind me, and turning, saw a young lady advancing, clad in deep mourning. Her sweet, sad face, her manner she held at her hound, told me who it was in an instant. I heard that you were here, she said, and I wished... Her voice faltered a little. My heart ached as I saw how her lip trembled, but before I could say anything, she went on. I wish to take your hand and thank you for your brotherly kindness to Alfred, and wanted to tell you that I am sure in all you did you acted tenderly and considerably for the best. Perhaps you may soon be going away from home, and we may not meet again. I shall never forget that you were more kind to him than he wanted a friend, and that you have the greatest claim of anyone on earth to be gratefully remembered in my thoughts as long as I live. I never saw her again. The chances and changes of life kept us apart, and when I last heard of her years and years ago, she was quite faithful to the memory of the dead, and was at as Emil still, for Alfred Monkton's sake.